2020 has proved to be a turning point in modern history. Before the outbreak of COVID-19, the world was already experiencing profound social, political, and geopolitical tensions. Now we live in an unprecedented world, as mired in uncertainty as it is eager for change. We must urgently find a way to reimagine and build the future together. The return of nationalism, the rise of xenophobia or neo-fascism, and the peak of technological revolution, scientific denial, or so-called post-truth narrative are some of the phenomena that threaten our democracies in this troubled period. They reveal how the hegemonic model is being questioned more than ever. However, the exceptionality of the current situation suggests the changes arising from this period may also take on an unparalleled magnitude. In light of these exceptional circumstances, Octagon 2020 takes place this year as an open virtual meeting. It gathers, as always, members and guests of the Common Action Forum, and this time our reflections will be shared publicly. The conversations here show the COVID-19 pandemic goes far beyond the mere health crisis. Its causal relationship with environmental destruction, economic shock, amplified social inequalities, and multiple geopolitical consequences demonstrate that we are, in fact, confronting the meta-crisis of civilizations.
It seems to me that the humanity that is facing something very critical, like the crisis of COVID-19, is in need for awakening on many fronts.
Que la política realmente tenga una función colectiva, que pueda gestionar mejor nuestra realidad, que es una realidad que va a ser mucho más compleja en el futuro de lo que es ahora.
Si no somos capaces de que la economía produzca más al servicio de la colectividad, vamos a tener grandes problemas.
And so people are starting the discussion, who will pay for this? Will the wealthy people have to participate more than they do yet now?
Humanity is always posing new challenges. The history is always posing new challenges, but depends on human action. Where we go.
There are ways for people to improve their standards of living and to, if necessary, to achieve growth without doing things exactly the way that we were doing it before.
The loss of, at the political level in particular, of the idea that imagination and creativity and even intuition about where we could possibly be going, could go to get ourselves into a new track, that's been just pushed out of the way.
I mean, here we're talking about this pandemic. It presents, both serious challenges to us. It's unprecedented. They expand the scope. And also, it's incumbent on us to see the silver lining, as they say, where we can benefit from this strenuous situation and try to improve.
Y para que la vacuna no sea una mercancía, ¿no? Sino un derecho humano. Vamos a ver ahora, cuando lleguen las vacunas, si esto se va a cumplir o si vamos a estar en uno de que las vacunas se aplican al mejor postor, ¿no?
There's a confirmation that the current system that we live in is not sustainable. It's a confirmation that many things need to be done.
Forces opposing the radical right are present and they are slowly regaining the surface.
My point is we need to direct our activism now moving forward towards forcing the World Health Organization and forcing the World Trade Organization to relax their patent rights.
Creo que en esta crisis de la pandemia lo que ha prevalecido no ha prevalecido la ciencia, ha prevalecido la economía de intereses.
I think COVID has highlighted the gaps, the difficulties, but also that there may be real opportunities to bring some sort of equality.
So this crisis came in a moment where there are many expectations, many failures to the system, the economic system, the international political system, international governance, and many other aspects of our global life. We have been going through this transformation for decades. We have developed institutions, we have developed infrastructure, But it seems to me that the human being was not at the center of all of that. It seems that profit, power, were the center of gravity rather than the interest of the human being. The balance between what is materialistic and what is humane. It seems to me all of that was forgotten. Now we are facing this, all of us, young and old, rich and poor, in every country, in every continent, all of us are facing it.
That this is not just a sanitary crisis with a pandemic. It's a whole cluster of crises, making it meta-crisis. And it's a unique opportunity for that, but also very challenging. Why? Because we have, first of all, non-represented or previous non-represented actors and elements that were not taken into consideration for the decision making, either at local or global. We have non-resolved topics or not addressed topics.
Além dessa tragédia em termos de saúde pública, ela também acaba, muitas vezes, sendo utilizada como pretexto de medidas extremas, não só por governos, mas também pelo próprio sistema de justiça. Então, ele pode, a pandemia também pode acabar sendo mal utilizada por governos ou por sistemas de justiça para aprofundar ainda mais a prática do lawfare.
This worldwide pandemic revealed very clearly problems that have already been in place, social, economic, and so forth. Second, that it has deepened these problems that are already characteristics of our era. The pandemic was not unexpected or impossible to predict. I mean, given the former SARS, MERS, these have been trends that have been happening already and present in the world, in our societies.
Inequalities are being exacerbated by the pandemic. So we can say that we are all in the same storm. However, we are not in the same boat, especially considering developing countries, Black people, women.
Y hemos visto cuáles son los engranajes o los mecanismos que permiten que una sociedad funcione. ¿Qué pasa cuando se para la producción? ¿Qué pasa cuando se para la economía? ¿Qué pasa cuando ciertos países han deslocalizado toda su industria a otros países para abaratar costes de producción y maximizar beneficios?
And we're now into the totally existential stage where not acting is producing greater and greater crises. And so something like a COVID is not an accident. It's not an accident. I mean, you even look at, we look at its causes. We know that everybody who knows anything about these things had been warning us for years that something like this was going to come.
Since the COVID crisis started, people have been using expressions like, oh, we'll be able to get back to normal again. And I think that when people talk in terms of getting back to normal, it's as if we haven't really taken the opportunity of the pandemic and the lockdown and the sort of pause for reflection to see whether normal is in any way sustainable.
I think it's important that when we speak about opportunities, we define what sort of opportunities, what is it that we want, and also go a little bit further and define who we are. Because in every transition in history, and I do believe that we are living in a historical transition, no doubt, there are many opportunists. There are many people in various political spheres that also perceive this transition as an opportunity. The populist right wing, even the neo-fascists see this as an opportunity. The left sees it as an opportunity, the progressives, the liberals, and so forth.
One interesting thing of the pandemic, which had already some sort of political consequences, is that it somehow highlighted that we are now living not only political shocks of a traditional nature, so to say, but also a battle between values. And this is a shock of values, a shock between the values of solidarity with egoism, the shock between, let us say, a more compassionate economic system vis-a-vis the strict liberal market or monopolistic market, if you wish. So all these things are not new. And in a way, one of the biggest crises that we are seeing, which is the crisis of neoliberalism, in reality, in Latin America, it started, and in other places as well.
Pero nosotros no hemos sido capaces de desarrollar una narrativa que pudiera de manera pedagógica mostrar a los sujetos cuál es su lugar en el mundo. Y ahora estamos sufriendo estas consecuencias, que son pues la falta de confianza y de credibilidad en las instituciones. En una sociedad que tiene el nivel de complejidad que tiene la nuestra, pues es imposible, es inviable vivir sin instituciones, ¿no? Esto no significa pues dar todo el poder y toda la autoridad a los expertos, pero significa que necesitamos poderes institucionales, necesitamos una red de instituciones, de relaciones que nos puedan aportar por lo menos un lugar para aterrizar en nuestra existencia.
This pandemic and what it means for most of the developed world is pretty much a wake-up call to open our eyes. We've been living under the illusion that, you know, we were advanced, that we were superior somehow, that we were entitled to these resources and to extract these resources in a way that was obviously not only not sustainable, but was outright cruel to many other humans.
What COVID did highlight, that even if you had wealth, you were not necessarily going to be saved, although your chances certainly did improve. And I think, you know, it gives us an opportunity to sit back and say, okay, what can be done in developing countries to address this disparity between public and private healthcare? It takes us back to the US as well, in terms of Obamacare, but also a comparison in terms of how Europe has dealt with the pandemic, you know, how public healthcare differs from France and Spain to the UK. And I think COVID has highlighted the gaps, the difficulties, but also that there may be real opportunities to bring some sort of equality.
With this pandemic, we've realized that countries need to invest internally. Domestic investment in science has become very important. But also at the same time, there's a need for countries, particularly in Africa, to look at investing in the medical field. Again, there is that temptation of making sure that people continue to rely on Western countries for the medical supply and the medical know-how. It's going to be up to Africans, by and large, to make sure that from now on they invest in science, and that from now on they somehow come up with mechanisms that will lure and attract back the African diaspora, most of whom have decided to settle overseas because of lack of opportunities in Africa, that they must come back whenever after they obtain their medical or scientific know-how and knowledge, they can come back and invest and go back.
Refugees right now, they, apart from the difficulties they're facing with the restricted mobility and the exposure that they already have, they're also facing like rising, even worse stigmatization than they already had from their host societies. And then also just looking at the in terms of like mobilization at the grassroots, in terms of kind of in the US, for example, reacting to police violence and people starting to take into their own hands the fact that they would really like to see active efforts to root out the systemic discrimination and inequalities.
When the COVID pandemic hit, first China and later Europe and still later the rest of the world, the immediate reaction is very much from below. So you start seeing self-initiated networks. I'm speaking about two kinds of networks, one being the extremely traditional kind of network, basically neighborhood communities. You see all of a sudden young people helping older people, people distributing masks or making masks for each other. These are really extremely analog kind of community support structures that have been there maybe in a latent way, but all of a sudden have come up. Right? So we see this as a manifestation of resilience of the society.
Creo que a pesar de que se han hecho más que evidentes las desigualdades y aunque hubo un atisbo de expresiones de solidaridad al inicio, ahorita la situación de precariedad de hospitales, de operadores de salud, de gente que trabaja en higiene y demás se normalizó. Y no hubo realmente un avance significativo en redignificar puestos de trabajo que están en la línea de fuego.
En un primer momento se las aplaudía, se las reconocía, en varias ciudades se salía a los balcones a aplaudir al personal sanitario y después quedaron en el olvido. Y cuando reclaman por mejores salarios, no parece haber lugar para sus reclamos. Entonces, claro, yo me pregunto, ¿qué pasa con ese personal sanitario que se expone día a día poniendo literalmente el cuerpo para tratar de evitar que el virus se propague? Hablamos básicamente del rol de quienes gobiernan una sociedad y el lugar que le dan. Y no solamente al personal sanitario, sino también a las personas consideradas esenciales, desde aquella persona que cosecha tomates o papas o sigue estando en una industria lechera, porque en la mayoría de los países creo que los productos básicos esenciales de alimentación no han cesado de distribuirse. Alguien sigue trabajando en la industria lechera, alguien sigue bajando de los camiones los cajones de leche, de papel higiénico para que lleguen al supermercado, para que otras personas puedan ir al supermercado y comprar esos productos. Y sin embargo no se las valora.
Estos trabajadores esenciales que son también el cuidatoriado, como dicen algunos teóricos del trabajo, porque no solamente son las clases cuidadoras, sino que son también el precariado, porque son quienes nos cuidan y quienes realizan esos servicios esenciales, pero en condiciones precarias, con salarios bajos y con muy poco reconocimiento social, a pesar de que si algo ha dejado al descubierto esta crisis es que los cuidados son el pilar de la sociedad.
We've had plenty of writing and critique and attempted policy measures to protect the caring class more, because they're still very unprotected in our societies, and they have no labor rights essentially, and they're undervalued and underpaid. And yet, even after we've kind of been slapped in the face with this very evident case of how much they're needed, we really haven't done anything. And I can't think of an example either of a government that's really ramped up efforts or aided. Is there a way to harness some sort of momentum, at least at the grassroots level or among not the political class is obviously not doing anything, but enough of a civil society movements or on the ground mobilizations to get them to listen? I mean, it feels like if we don't do it now, that it's going to become a distant memory as soon as they get a vaccine.
But there was nevertheless a sense that this could be an opportunity and that the pandemic could lead to important paradigm shifts in terms of the kind of social contracts that the different countries we live in have imposed on their societies, and obviously also an international social contract, a sort of globalized social contract that needs to significantly evolve. I'm more pessimistic now. I think the COVID-19 virus has not been a progressive virus. It's been a reactionary virus in political terms. It's essentially made things that were bad, that were already bad, worse, significantly worse. If you look at inequality, it's worsened. If you look at who the most vulnerable people have been during this crisis, they've been the people that were already in a precarious situation. So the poorest of society, the people who were facing informal forms of employment.
First of all, the governments on the right have been literally incapable of dealing with this because they don't believe, they don't want to change the system. They want to continue on the road that they're on. I don't know if that gives you a bit of a sense of the continuing. It used to, in 2008, it was an unwillingness to change or an incapacity to imagine how to change. Now it's actually, they've seen it, they know what needs to be done, and they refuse to do it.
In this situation, we've been nine months in the pandemic with no schools for the whole of society, because the states have not been able to prepare schools to go back to functioning while all the private sector is already functioning. What is the immediate, result of this? It's the economic gap widening. It's the social gap widening. It's this, what I was mentioning at the beginning, of problems that are already present have been made even worse. It's a deepening of the problems that we've already been seeing that are present. So in this context, we have also been seeing for the last 10 years, at least, social rebellions happening throughout the world. So North Africa, Arab countries, Middle East, Sudan, Lebanon, Libya, Iraq, Iran, and not to speak of Central America. So a bit, not now, but Puerto Rico, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, not to speak of Peru just now, or Hong Kong. So tendencies of social rebellion that have already been happening and that are due to the social gap and the revolt against social and economic problems that are present in society have been also deepening.
Un tema muy importante que preexistía la crisis. Creo que ese tema que está en el corazón de lo que hace CAF es un tema que deberá profundizarse y en el cual los poderes públicos y los nuevos gobiernos pues deben pues darle toda la atención que merece este tema, teniendo en cuenta cómo se ha ampliado la brecha de desigualdad en el mundo.
This is the authoritarian destruction of reality, of the dream that the Arab world and the Arab youth had in their mind. Now, what is going to happen from now on? We have given so much time to these regimes that have really revolted against the Arab Spring and the spirit of the Arab Spring to do something positive, but they have not. Reality today is much more worse than 2010 and 2011. Dictatorship is much more authoritative. Our jails are more full of activists than before. And our economic situation is declining day after day. It is even much worse than what we had 2010. Corruption as well. Adding to that, the assassination of transformation to democracy in a peaceful manner. So the future in this part of the world is the following. Either we resume the spirit of the Arab Spring, which is the peaceful quest for democracy and transparency, or we are going to face a generation that is extremely angry.
Disregarding the well-being of the young has consequences way beyond economics. I mean, it means actively ostracizing generations out of the role in their own communities. A public policy that not only gives up addressing their problems, but does not even appeal to them by name, is bound to produce generational disenfranchisement with democracy and institutions. And that is an incredibly dangerous thing. Before 2008, disenfranchised youth tended not to vote. And during the crisis, many initially believed that it could even become something positive, in the sense that if well catalyzed, it could become a driving force for deep political and economic reform. But in fact, in several cases, it gave way for many to capitalize fear and anger in form of alt-right policies.
Y paradójicamente, la gente que más busca el orden, digamos la derecha o la derecha extrema, es la que ha sacado su aspecto más libertario, ¿no? Si pudiéramos decir así. Y es la que está abanderando de una u otra forma en las calles, digamos, la revolución contra este estado de las cosas, pero no de una manera efectiva ni creíble, desde luego, porque tampoco les interesa, digamos, los derechos civiles.
In the beginning of the COVID situation, of course, many people said that the COVID might bring the end of globalization. because now everyone is closing down. That's, in terms of migration, hate for foreigners, even using, like things like Islamophobia in order to justify also stigmatizing certain communities, whether it's in India, whether it's in Great Britain, whether it's in the United States, in France, and so on. Of course, this is a global, this is a universal problem, and it has to be also dealt with universally. However, the history, our recent history shows that this kind of, multilateral transnational organizations like the United Nations, WHO, and all that are not really effective in addressing this issue. So it has to be a combined effort.
Creo que en el mundo digital van a aparecer muchísimos retos a nivel social, porque hasta ahora nosotros pensábamos en los derechos humanos desde la perspectiva de ciudadanos, pero cuando pasamos a la digitalización el concepto ciudadano desaparece y aparece un nuevo ente que es el de usuario generador de comportamientos, de behaviors, que son los que nutren las diferentes industrias.
So that, you see, no country in Europe has a Ministry of Immigration and Citizenship. None. In every country in Europe, immigration and citizenship comes under the Ministry of the Interior, the police. Everything is there. That tells you everything right there. At the cabinet table, there's a very powerful Minister of the Interior, security, the police, and so on. And then there's nobody to answer to that minister to say, well, actually, there's another side to the story. And it's not all negative and fear and problems. It's actually a great possibility and not simply an ethical obligation. If we use our imaginations, this is an incredible possibility for our country.
Basically, big pharma, and being against big pharma has resulted in people going against science. And I think we haven't seen the same in the developing world. So there's definitely a note to be made to say that in terms of the developing world, there has been a greater and much wider acceptance and reliance on science as being the solution. And you'll see across Africa and much of the developing world that all the strategies in terms of social distancing, in terms of using of masks, in terms of sanitizing, etc., was readily accepted. And we see this, in contrast with in many of the Western countries.
Por un lado es el problema ontológico en sí mismo, es decir, ¿qué tipo de sujetos esta sociedad está produciendo? Luego tenemos el problema, que es un problema epistemológico, es como cuáles son los conocimientos que hacen parte de esa sociedad y que ahora mismo podrían orientarnos hacia un mapa de actuación en una situación de pandemia, ¿no? Y finalmente el problema, que es un problema ya axiológico, que son como cuáles son los valores de estas decisiones o de estas acciones. Y todo esto culmina con la noción de libertad. ¿Qué es la libertad? Todo esto funciona como una ideología que da a los individuos la sensación de que son autosuficientes, de que, en fin, pueden acceder y que son merecedores de acceder a determinados puestos o de determinadas posiciones. Pero lo que falta en nuestra sociedad actualmente, y esto es parte del contrato social que necesita reevaluarse, rehacerse, es exactamente el lugar del individuo y el lugar del colectivo. Porque hoy por hoy una persona aislada no sería capaz de hacer absolutamente nada. Todo lo que uno hace está vinculado a entornos tecnológicos que dependen también de entornos naturales, que también dependen de una serie de interacciones sociales. El individuo no puede hacer absolutamente nada solo, pero al mismo tiempo los individuos que están producidos en esta matriz social hoy día pues están dotados de una idea de sí mismos de que, bueno, todo es accesible, si tengo condiciones de comprar, pues entonces tengo el derecho de hacerlo. Y no hay, pues, una reflexión acerca de la repercusión de sus acciones en el mundo.
consider Trump and Bolsonaro, they both won elections to powerful countries by waving the anti-system flag and pretending to fight corruption and corporate interest while bolstering hate speech and disregarding immigrants and other minorities, disguising them as the core of the problem. And it is not even ironic that they ended up favoring that same elite that they claimed they were going to fight. Corporate interests, Wall Street, Big Pharma.
Un proyecto político que se aproxima a una especie de fascismo. Yo creo que eso tiene un futuro que dependerá mucho de cómo se desarrolla la economía. Es decir, la economía tiene que ser una economía, como he dicho antes, que ayude también al equilibrio social. Los fascismos y los regímenes populistas nacen cuando hay una distribución económica que ven que no es justa. Y eso moviliza a la gente, las moviliza hacia posiciones de derecha extrema. Trump es el ejemplo. Trump ganó las elecciones con el voto ingenuo de los más desfavorecidos. Y al revés, la reforma fiscal, por ejemplo, de Trump es una reforma fiscal que ayuda a los que más tienen. Luego, esa mentira que va implícita en el populismo, yo creo que hay que ser capaces de denunciarla y de desmontarla, ¿no?
It's very clear when we see that the economic result of the pandemic is possibly worse than that of 1929. I mean, in 2020, in 3 months, we've had, the 3 first months, we've had an economic a crisis or a gap of possibly 6% of decline in economic conditions in the world, which is equivalent to 3 years in 1929. And with possibly now also long-term effects that might actually exceed those of the Great Depression of the beginning of the century. Unemployment is up to possibly 10% worldwide.
El capitalismo se mueve rapidísimamente y el contexto de pandemia primaba toda esta economía emergente basada en la predicción, en la inteligencia artificial, en la digitalización, en el conocimiento de los comportamientos. Para ellos es un laboratorio fantástico.
Indeed, there are, of course, big winners of COVID. These winners are those global digital companies who, let's say, arrange to pay either no taxes at all or to pay them in countries where the tax standards are very low. And so a cooperation, perhaps on a regional level or on the global level, will be necessary to make them pay, let's say, normal taxes. I know this is very, very, very difficult to arrange, but this will be necessary. And during the COVID discussion, the discussion about Google and Apple and Facebook and all those guys who do not, or Amazon, who do not pay adequate taxes, that they have to pay the taxes as well.
But also how wealth has been taken by these major players like Amazon and these tech companies who are actually benefiting from this crisis, and how the progressive movement can also reach and send his message to the people. And I can see this very clearly in the US election, when you can see that you had a struggle inside the Democratic Party on the narrative that has to be given to the electorate. And you can see that the candidates from the Progressive Caucus won more seats actually than the more mainstream Democratic Party. I think that's also a point that should be highlighted. How this issue of inequality should be addressed to the population, and how could be the outcomes of this pandemic in the narrative of the progressive.
We carry on the fight for the dramatic transformation of the economic structures we all interact in. And beyond this, I think, and this is my final point here, we need to carry on fighting this extremely ideological fight, which is fundamentally a fight about ends and means. And it's the fight surrounding the issue of neoliberalism. I think that's the best way of calling it.
Y la manera de acabar con esa trampa de la pobreza y esa trampa del desempleo es probablemente abordar de una forma seria una renta básica universal. Pero claro, es verdad que no puede ser lo suficientemente baja para que no haya ningún efecto sobre el conjunto de la población y concretamente sobre los más vulnerables. Y si es lo suficientemente alta, probablemente no pueda financiarse. Entonces digamos que hace falta la cuadratura del círculo, ¿no? Hace falta ese equilibrio perfecto para que sea algo que promueva un cambio social, pero no tan agresivo como para que produzca un rechazo social mayoritario.
What we understand as global economic growth has been accompanied by environmental degradation, increasing emissions, a rise in ecological footprint, and a lot of inequality. And all of that does huge damage to the environment and the way we live. So I really like this new philosophy almost that has emerged and that propose that our societies should be based around a well-being economy. And in this well-being economy that they call, governments should value people's well-being over wealth and should use more encompassing indicators. And they suggest a bunch of different ones. So there is the Gini Index, there's the UN's Human Development Index, the Happy Planet Index. So that these different indicators should guide decision making.
Yo me sorprendí allá por abril de este año cuando la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos se mandó una resolución, la número 1/2020, que nunca vi un texto tan bien confeccionado, diría, y tan equidistante o tan distante directamente de lo que es la conducción política de la Organización de Estados Americanos, ¿no? Realmente la forma en que definen los valores en juego, la situación de desigualdad extrema que atraviesa el continente americano, las poblaciones vulnerables y las más de 60 recomendaciones que da a los gobiernos, entre las cuales estuvo una de ellas de suspender los pagos de los servicios de la deuda externa y buscar de bajar el monto y el peso de esa deuda.
Creo que uno de los espacios donde se ha expresado la desigualdad en el acceso digital en este momento ha sido en el caso de la educación, en todos sus niveles, desde la educación preescolar hasta la educación superior. Y en eso las tecnologías digitales han mostrado y han amplificado esas brechas finalmente. Y el gran problema, si lo queremos ver desde el punto de vista digital, no solamente son los excluidos, ¿sí? No solamente los subconectados a las tecnologías digitales.
Here we're talking about this pandemic. It presents, both serious challenges to us. It's unprecedented. They expand the scope, and also it's incumbent on us to see the silver lining, as they say, where we can benefit from this strenuous situation and try to improve, find improvements and so on. Alternative models for higher education that can produce some kind of a blended education, accessible education, futuristic education, using the opportunities that the situation or the COVID-19 situation. If you look at this, now the focus is on what? Producing, and I'm using this word, let's say creating, manufacturing a new graduate that can respond to the challenges in the post-COVID situation and the post-COVID world. That person should be highly intelligent, highly critical, problem solver, digital literate, really mastering digital technology and so on. All the curricula has to be redesigned in a way that is really kind of what we call in a disruptive way, a disruptive education.
This is over. Do something else. This is the moment to reimagine the educational system. And for example, we can't keep the attention of the students because there are a whole pile of reasons that, you know, this slow, tedious, memory-based system just bores them to death. They've got all these other exciting things that they can do with each other in terms of communications. Let's do it differently. Let's make it much more existential. Let's have smaller classrooms. You know, then the governments and the bureaucrats say, oh, that'll cost a lot of money. Well, if it doesn't work, you're not saving money by having bigger classes. You're going to make money. You know, this is how the economy is dependent of imagination. You're going to make more money with smaller classes because you're going to end up with better educated and more engaged and more risk-oriented graduates, as opposed to people who've memorized a lot of stuff and have been sort of stuck in these big groups being talked at by bored teachers who are bored to death because they're not allowed to use their imaginations.
So we should ask, why have governments, societies, and specifically the place where I come from, the scientific community, academic community, been so incapable and unprepared to deal with this problem? Well, part of it is certainly due to this new way of functioning of the scientific academia, of universities, this absolutely individualist, competitive, and numerical arena in which we are being transformed, you know, transiting in universities, showing this incapability to act collectively, to think collectively, to stop in the middle of a crisis like this, stop the individualistic production and think of how to collaborate. And this has to do with financing, of course. When financing, academic financing has been for 10, 20, 30 years transiting from states to the private sector, to the point in which we are in a situation in which the private sector is actually starting to determine what universities, researchers, and so on are going to research, are going to do. So this has revealed, I think, an inversion in priorities in many fields, but specifically in the academic field. And what should be a way of making the state less heavy, you know, having financing transit to the private sector, has actually left states and governments totally helpless, you know, fragile in face of the pandemic.
Donc en fait, c'était sur ce rapport aux scientifiques et à la science, il y a une réelle, il y a vraiment quelque chose à reconstruire, à imaginer une vraie alliance vraiment avec les scientifiques, qui sont évidemment des outils précieux, au moment où en plus une partie de la gauche et des écologistes confondent progrès occidental de surconsommation égale science. Voilà. Et donc du coup, par principe, nous sommes contre toute innovation scientifique. Alors qu'en fait, ce qu'ils veulent dire, c'est que nous sommes contre toute innovation technologique superflue. Voilà. Donc, je crois vraiment que il faut à la fois qu'on construise un nouveau rapport à la science sur de nouvelles bases, c'est-à-dire en essayant de faire comprendre aux scientifiques comment est-ce qu'on peut traduire leurs recherches dans la vraie vie et comment est-ce que ça peut être utile à la définition de nouvelles stratégies opérationnelles d'une part, et puis deuxièmement, en ayant nous-mêmes au sein de notre propre famille, activistes, société civile, etc., une sorte de pédagogie autour de ces questions scientifiques où on a tendance parfois justement à les balayer, alors qu'au contraire, ça doit être le socle sur lequel on bâtit l'ensemble de nos stratégies.
The rise of business schools was the sign of the disaster, because they're anti-imagination, anti-creativity, and they're all about measuring wealth in the narrowest possible way. So as you saw business schools spreading around the Western world and then the world, you could see the whole thing falling apart. They've done more damage than any other organized educational system, I don't know, that I can think of in modern history. More damage. And they have done nothing for business. you know, because most people who go to business schools end up in finance, which is largely speculation. So they're not actually about the running of businesses even.
We have a permanent impasse or standby that we see reflected on many regional, local, or global conflicts. And we also have to deconstruct many concepts. We are not yet. We are not even working on that. But we cannot put on the side all that we achieved in terms of human rights, on gender inclusion. But those are not resolved topics. So there are many things that we have first to consider and to resolve as an impasse. Why we're not reaching solutions? Because in this puzzle that is the world, these pieces were not included. And there are still many missing ones. If we do not include them, never a solution, never an answer, never a proposal, and never an initiative will be achieved. Always will be incomplete.
We are going to ABC, but rather I think that you, government, must go back and do X, Y, Z, the goal, like sustainable development goals. There are things that you need to do if you want to reach the goal. And they don't have to be about conferences and drawing up, as I say, it needs to be saying, this is what is going to be in your school curriculum. This is what is going to be taught. You know, these are the sorts of areas where it's not difficult to change, but because we've got this idea that, well, this is how we do it. And, you know, it becomes a sort of mindset that, and that's why I think that when these conferences come up, we need to look at this sort of macro level of how we do things.
For our international utopias to become true, we have also to think of a new kind of multilateralism in which things, I mean, in trade, in finance, but also in peace and security. So I think the pandemic somehow, it didn't create all these needs, it didn't create all these crises, but it was a catalyzer. And certainly it highlighted the importance of solidarity, the importance of public space in internal economies.
One of the unintended consequences of the Trump administration is the fact that it has forced many countries around the world, regionally and transnationally, to think outside of the American box. This whole idea that every conflict, every problem, every war has to be somehow within the sphere of American foreign policy business. And it's an American political issue, whether in Venezuela or Nagorno-Karabakh, the exact same subject.
Richer countries have ordered and kind of ordered the vaccine. So it's going to be the rich countries first who are going to get access to vaccine, even though there's been a gentleman's agreement that all of us will have access to the actual ingredient of producing the vaccine. But there's been also the challenge of patenting the patent rights of the vaccine, which means that those poor countries like African countries are actually going to be the tail end of receiving the vaccine. So we would have thought that there was going to be a just and an equal distribution of a vaccine as soon as it was established. But we see now that, you know, all of these Moderna and Pfizer have already, you know, lined in their orders.
Global health has become a big business, whether in terms of market opportunities or in terms of actors and its initiatives. So it's just to be sure that we are addressing global health not as a matter of emerging diseases or epidemic threats. Of course, every crisis has global health implications related to financial collapse, employment, political instability, social insecurity, or any other problem. So we need to pay close attention to how health, and then I mean locally and globally, relates to organization of political and economical activity social structures, and mainly the distribution of power and control over wealth and resources.
For the first time, we saw that even the private healthcare facilities, largely that service, a more middle class, were also being completely inundated with patients, and there was a large danger of people who actually had, medical insurance not being able to receive, healthcare, and it actually brought human beings for a little while on par. To say that those who were and could always afford medical insurance and medical care suddenly found themselves having money but no access to healthcare. And I think this should definitely highlight the plight of millions across the developing world who can't access decent healthcare.
La Organización Mundial de la Salud ha sido una especie de organización abandonada por la comunidad internacional. Y en este momento, cuando estamos hablando, Estados Unidos ha abandonado la presencia en la Organización Mundial de la Salud. Eso es absolutamente inaceptable, ¿no? En un momento en que el mundo tiene una pandemia, que el Estado más importante, el país más importante, se dé de baja, abandone la organización única que tiene competencias globales en cuestiones de salud, es incomprensible. Luego, si vemos la financiación de la Organización Mundial de la Salud, es también incomprensible. En este momento, el máximo donante de ayuda a la Organización Mundial de la Salud no es un Estado, es Bill Gates, por encima de Alemania, por encima del Reino Unido, por encima de China. Esto es absolutamente también extraño, ¿no? Deberíamos los países hacer un esfuerzo mayor para mantener la Organización Mundial de la Salud, que va a ser enormemente importante como institución si queremos que realmente haya una multilateralización de la salud global. La Organización Mundial de la Salud es la organización.
The greatest concern with global health is the patent rights. World Health Organization, World Trade Organization both of them have been very problematic for developing world and particularly the global south, because notwithstanding that we've got ingredients to make vaccines, we've got ingredients to make medicine, but we can't, because these things, even though we have them and we grow them in our backyards, are patented. We've had an AIDS pandemic raging in various African countries for years. India decided to produce a very cheap antiretroviral drug. Guess what? As us South Africans, we couldn't buy that because we had somehow ratified some policy within the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization, which prevented us from accessing the very cheap drug that we could get from India, which was not even half the price. It was a fraction of the price. And guess who was here to provide us with we were forced to purchase from? It was Pfizer. You have a lot of piracy within the developing world, people trying to come up with their own backyard concoctions of medicines because of these patent rights. So the plea, and I think moving forward, activism should be directed towards forcing the World Health Organization to understand that Africans must not be subjected to these patent rights.
COVID-19 is some sort of a burning glass where we can see the problems even sharper, the problems that we had. But I'm a bit cautious, not about that what we want, and in that what we want and we feel where the development should go. But I would say we have to wait for some months before at least I can say whether there will be a real chance to a new multilateralism.
You cannot understand things like climate change or health depending on one country, or in 2 countries, or in 5 countries of the Security Council nowadays. If the Security Council doesn't act, nothing happens. But if it acts, it acts in accordance with the principles of 5 permanent members. That cannot be. So we have to redefine that and find a way, I'm not saying exactly which, in which we find a more democratic world in which both Latin America, a united Latin America, which is only possible with more progressive government, and a united Europe, even accepting some degree of plurality, this can help change, and this will be good for Africa, this will be good for other countries, and that will help create a more multipolar world. And a multipolar world has to be the base for a real multilateralism. Nothing is given, all is there to fight for, but I think it's a fight worth taking.
Porque hay muchos problemas globales que atañen a bienes públicos globales que no se pueden resolver sin la cooperación de China. Y hay que ser capaces de encontrar las maneras de resolver esos problemas en cooperación con China. Que con China no se puede estar de acuerdo en todo, lo acepto, pero lo que sí hay obligación de estar de acuerdo en aquellos temas que requieren la organización global.
A lot of problems with the budget and the huge sums that are prepared to be delivered to the countries in the south of Europe, and the blackmailing policy of Hungary and Poland. And so tomorrow and in the days after tomorrow, we will see whether there will be a chance that Europe gets a bit less weak politically as it is or not. So I think this has a real interesting connection to COVID because everyone needs it. And on one hand, we can see that Poland's reactionary government and the government of Hungary, which is beyond being reactionary, they are blackmailing and they are using, of course, Spain and Italy and other southern countries who need the money to get their political and ideological goals through. And we will have to see what is possible. At the moment, I can't tell you what the outcome will be.
Make no mistake, the United States will continue to defend the interests of the United States. I mean, there is no doubt about that. I mean, there is an old saying like the business of the United States is business. So they will continue to see that way. So don't, but having said that, as I say, in politics, and especially international politics, new answers matter. New answers may mean hundreds of thousands of lives. So I think the way they will defend their own interests will be different in a way. Will be more friendly to others, to other opinions.
So in the global south, in Latin America, you see essentially the great victims of this pandemic being informal workers, people who don't have the possibility of working from home and have to go out every day in order to make a living. In terms of gender, the COVID-19 crisis has been extremely reactionary. It's been anti-feminist. It's essentially relegated women to going back to care duties in the care economy. In many instances, it's also meant that it's also kind of made visible something that was already there, which is the fact that women have less secure forms of employment and therefore have been more likely to face the loss of their employment or unemployment. It's also been, I mean, this has to do with the care economy and so on. It's also revealed the fact that no schools and no institutions for children have meant women have gone back to that role of caring for children more than men have. You know, and work had sort of mitigated or hidden or dressed up these kinds of supposed equality within the couple also, which we are now discovering when there's an urgency, when there's an emergency, when there's an unusual situation, we return to old patterns in terms of gender divisions.
Sí creo que es una oportunidad para debatir temas respecto de lo colectivo que tal vez antes no se debatían, como nosotros estamos haciendo en este mismo momento, de pensar que las personas esenciales no son solamente aquellas que se dedican a la salud, sino también a la alimentación. Pero en realidad deberíamos llegar a algo mucho más amplio. Toda persona es esencial. Toda persona que muere es una tristeza para una sociedad. Toda persona que no pudo acceder a un servicio médico ver las ambulancias en Italia frente a una sala de emergencia, una detrás de la otra, y que no hay capacidad para atender a esa gente, nos tiene que llevar a reflexionar qué pasa con la salud, por qué la salud no está disponible para todo el mundo y por qué solamente las personas que tienen grandes recursos económicos pueden acceder a determinados bienes, inclusive la salud. Creo que es un buen momento para debatir esto, para dar el debate, aunque creo que los grandes poderes económicos y los grandes medios de comunicación no quieren dar ese debate. Prefieren que esto pase lo más rápido posible y volver a lo que se llama normalidad, volver al mundo prepandemia como si no hubiera pasado absolutamente nada.
En esa difícil dicotomía, también falsa, entre economía y salud, ¿no? Que me recuerda a esa dicotomía o esa metáfora que se suele hablar, que al principio del siglo, sobre todo, entre seguridad y libertad, ¿no? No había por qué elegir, había que ponderar y realmente había que tomar políticas públicas basadas en datos fiables dentro de un contexto de incertidumbre, es verdad, pero con las reglas jurídicas que no son nuevas, que nos hemos dado y que básicamente constituyen el cuerpo de un Estado de Derecho en una democracia. Tenemos que defender también las libertades y los derechos civiles. No hemos sido lo suficientemente, digamos, claros ante la ciudadanía para establecer una férrea defensa de los principios fundamentales del Estado de Derecho y de esa ponderación entre la salud de todos y las libertades individuales.
Suecia, que creyó que sus ciudadanos pues podrían decidir por sí mismos y que sus hospitales pues quizás también estarían en condiciones de atender a los enfermos caso la gente de manera general no adoptara la cuarentena o no se quedara en casa como se había pedido que se hiciera en otros países de manera más obligatoria. Y bueno, ahora vemos que Suecia, en comparación a sus países vecinos, pues está sufriendo mucho más el efecto de la pandemia, no solamente en los casos de muertes, que son muy superiores a de sus vecinos, pero también la economía ha sufrido con esto.
A virus which politically has enabled certain governments to literally save their skins has also reinforced some authoritarian tendencies of certain governments by using the pandemic as a pretext to crack down on protest, even on freedom of expression, on all sorts of dimensions of political life, including political participation, but also various forms of dissent and political opposition.
Lo que puedo ver es la felicidad que tienen los poderosos de gobernar en un estado de excepción, de reinstaurar controles que serían inaceptables en circunstancias normales y de mantenerlo de extenderlo lo más que se pueda. Por supuesto, si tienes el poder y si tienes un poder limitado y tienes una ventana de oportunidad para flexibilizar esas limitaciones, lo lógico es que ese poder se expanda. Sería muy raro ver que un poderoso quiera autolimitar su poder.
Quienes construyeron las naciones latinoamericanas, y me centro básicamente en América Latina, pensaron en articular poder económico, poder político, poder mediático, poder jurídico, militar y diplomático. Por eso las leyes favorecían siempre a los poderes dominantes. Aquello que en muchos países de América Latina siempre se dice, que un ladrón de gallinas va preso y un ladrón de guante blanco queda libre, porque tiene los recursos económicos para tener abogados que conocen al Poder Judicial, todos los pasillos del Poder Judicial, para saber cómo quedar libres, aunque hayan estafado a miles y miles de personas por mucho dinero. Por lo tanto, el gran dilema para los sectores progresistas es cómo tratar con un poder judicial que nació sirviendo a las clases dominantes. Entonces creo que el problema central es el estructural. ¿Se pueden tocar algunas leyes? ¿Se pueden cambiar algunas leyes? Sí, pero hasta que no haya una reforma radical de los poderes judiciales, nos vamos a encontrar con estos vaivenes, que llega un gobierno conservador y de la noche a la mañana puede borrar de un plumazo, por ejemplo, conquistas sociales.
Esa desgraciada característica del Poder Judicial que no es ni republicano ni representativo. Y no es republicano porque no hay en la República cargos vitalicios. Todos los cargos deben ser periódicos, renovables, pero de ninguna manera vitalicios. Y no son representativos, sostenemos, porque la voluntad popular no se puede expresar muy directo sobre la integración de los magistrados del Poder Judicial. Por eso también es que propiciamos una reforma constitucional profunda, para ir agrietando esa inmundicia y perversidad del lawfare y poder ir estallando estas causas que realmente han perjudicado enormemente la dignidad del discurso jurídico y de las prácticas jurisdiccionales, ¿no?
Alguien me decía que el siglo XIX era el del Parlamento, el XX el de los gobiernos y el XXI será el siglo de los y las jueces. Yo tengo la impresión de que el Poder Judicial se está organizando como un poder isla. Cuando quien juzga pierde el papel de garante de los derechos de los demás y tiene una trayectoria política propia o se constituye en un poder político propio que no tiene legitimidad democrática y que además puede tener unos objetivos diferentes o tener alianzas coyunturales con otros ámbitos políticos, pues eso nos pone en riesgo a todos y todas. Para él el derecho, como para muchos ámbitos políticos, es algo banal, no existe, lo mismo se cambia, que se reinterpreta, que directamente se obvia o que ahora decimos una cosa y luego decimos otra. Una total banalización del derecho y por lo tanto una destrucción de todas las garantías.
O sea, a mí me parece importante del lawfare, digamos, el efecto que produce como pedagogía del escarmiento político, que decía Nicolás Trota con otros autores en un libro sobre el lawfare en Brasil, en el sentido de que provoca una serie de incentivos y desincentivos bastante perversos, donde los desincentivos van dirigidos a la ciudadanía, digamos, y los incentivos al Poder Judicial. Es decir, creo que cualquier líder de base, cualquier dirigente comunitario o cualquier simple ciudadano comprometido que quiere involucrarse en política para cambiar la realidad, se va a ver desincentivado cuando se pare a analizar todos estos procesos de lawfare que llevamos viendo muy crudamente, donde hay sentencias absolutamente desproporcionadas y ejemplarizantes, porque el mensaje que de alguna manera están recibiendo es: cuidado, no te metas en política, que cuando cambie el poder puedes acabar muy fácilmente en la cárcel.
Ele sempre deixou claro, né, que era juiz que estava não para julgar alguém com imparcialidade, mas sim para aplicar a lei contra os seus inimigos, contra os seus oponentes.
Era uma vez juiz que não era juiz, que era acusador, mas não era acusador, que odiava defensores e agora virou defensor. Eu acho que bem resumidamente, mas é escândalo.
Parece bastante claro que estos jueces y magistrados que se prestan a encarcelar al adversario político del gobierno de turno reciben generosos pagos por sus servicios, digamos, mientras que, como decía, el mensaje que está llegando a la población es que el precio que pueden llegar a pagar si se implican en política para transformar su realidad es demasiado alto, porque es nada menos que su libertad.
Até quando o mundo poderá aguentar o revolving door sem que haja maiores danos às democracias? Eu acho importante a gente ter essa discussão em mente para que não ocorra de novo o que ocorre agora de forma escandalosa, no caso com o juiz Sérgio Moro.
The year 2019 was a real awakening, especially from October 2019 onwards, and I would say until early 2020. There were protests everywhere, first in Haiti, then in Ecuador, then in Chile, in Colombia, and elsewhere, protesting aggressive reforms of a return to very fundamentalist forms of neoliberalism, accompanied by the IMF, unfortunately. And the pandemic sort of put an end to this by sending people back to the private sphere and moving them out of the public sphere. And of course, protest and political mobilization is a very public activity. And so it's very incompatible with confinement and social distancing and the various forms of isolation that have been necessary in a pandemic.
O cidadão no mundo perdeu o poder de se indignar, quer dizer, não fica mais indignado com medidas violentas, com medidas abusivas, com medidas autoritárias que violam flagrantemente o rule of law. Eu acho que é importante a gente voltar a trazer isso para o cidadão, para que ele possa entender, voltar a se indignar e entender qualquer tipo de violação que venha ocorrer contra seus direitos e contra a democracia, porque de violação em violação é que você, na verdade, desconstrói todo o rule of law, todo o Estado democrático de direito.
Yo creo que desde principios de este siglo estamos, digamos, afinando de una u otra manera medidas de control y vigilancia que vienen de lejos. Empezaron con los atentados de las Torres Gemelas y a partir de ahí se han ido agudizando, además porque la tecnología lo va permitiendo cada vez más y porque el derecho en esto llega muchísimo más tarde de lo que va a llegar, digamos, las posibilidades técnicas de control. Todo esto ha estallado en el marco de una pandemia que ha agudizado absolutamente toda esa crisis. Yo quiero decir que toda la perspectiva de protección de los derechos civiles que uno lleva al lugar donde se deciden las cosas, de una u outra forma ha sufrido un naufragio ético y moral.
A pandemia, sem dúvida alguma, ela está criando um grande desafio para o mundo em termos de saúde pública, mas também desafios em termos da observância do devido processo legal e de todas as garantias fundamentais, porque a pandemia ela acaba, de certa forma, tirando muitas vezes o foco de onde está ocorrendo um ataque de lawfare, porque evidentemente que as pessoas estão preocupadas com as suas próprias vidas. Então essa guerra jurídica inerente ao lawfare, que geralmente já é invisível, ela acaba passando ainda mais desapercebida da população. Então, é um momento realmente que merece muita reflexão e, claro, além da preocupação com a saúde pública, nós temos que ter também a preocupação do uso indevido da pandemia para ofuscar ainda mais essa prática nociva do lawfare, que acaba resultando na erosão das democracias ao redor do mundo.
I think it's urgent to define what the fundamental flaws of our societies and our system are in order for us to propose some sort of solution. And I do think that it is fundamentally a dysfunction of democracy that we are dealing with, even if democracy is a concept that, of course, can vary from one society to the other. But I do think that the lack of representation, proper representation of different sectors of society, more diverse than any time before, is provoking this imbalance and this rupture in a sort of equilibrium that we at least had the illusion that we had achieved at some point, right? The end of history.
I think it's safe to say that right now we are living through these unprecedented, very disruptive, but rather predictable also times. The current overlapping crises ranging from the early stages of a deep economic depression, climate and biodiversity collapses already showing its signs and its effects in our day-to-day lives. Widespread protests caused by police brutality and structural racial injustices. Not to say also mounting attacks to democracies and its institutions and principles around the world. So these crises have not been created by COVID, but rather exposed or magnified by the global pandemic. And we urgently, almost desperately, need to promote some profound systemic changes. And we also need to change the way we eat, consume, produce, the way we measure growth and progress, the way governments imposes taxes or gives out subsidies.
Now, what we've seen is humans reacting to short-term threats that affect their livelihoods, their generations, their loved ones, their family, much more than humans reacting to a much more existential threat, but a much more abstract threat, which is climate change. And that's fascinating because climate change is a much greater existential threat on our species than this particular pandemic. But because it's so abstract, because we're going to see the rise of oceans in a few decades, because it's going to affect our children and our grandchildren, so on and so forth, we have been unable to take the drastic measures that we have nevertheless taken in many instances and in many countries in the world, affecting our social welfare and affecting our economies and affecting our well-being.
It is a message from nature. It is a message from the planet, from the globe, telling us that you have shared realities and you have shared future and you have shared interest. And then we have to destroy these boundaries that we have created through our institutionalized interest, profit-centered interest, power-centered interest. So the first lesson for me is, can we discover the fact that all of us are equal and all of us share and really share the future? It's not about who is owning and who is not owning. It is all of us sharing the future. We need a new political system to cater for this new spirit. We need a new global governance.
Y para el futuro, ¿qué hacemos, no? Bueno, yo creo que para el futuro vamos a tener que darle una enorme prioridad a los derechos económicos, sociales, culturales y ambientales. Paso el aviso de que ya no se habla solamente de económicos, sociales y culturales, sino que la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos ha incorporado con la misma jerarquía y nivel los derechos ambientales. Estamos siendo depredados por estas empresas que lo único que buscan es sacar oro y tiran entonces cianuro al agua potable que infiltra la tierra, que pudre el aire. Si sigue esta degradación y, por supuesto, el riesgo de extinción de esta especie que llamamos el ser humano. Naciones Unidas tiene que tomar una actitud mucho más enérgica en cuanto a que lo que se hace en un punto del planeta repercute en todo el planeta entero.
Once again, and I think it's always good to emphasize that the loss of biodiversity is not only an environmental issue, it's also a development issue, it's an economic issue, it's a global security issue. And I think it's also safe to say it's an ethical and moral issue. And I think at the end of the day, it's also a self-preservation issue, as we have seen with the COVID crisis. It is a consequence of our constant entrenchment into wild places and us forcing a closer contact between humans and wildlife.
Il est important de construire un nouveau récit en décrivant la structure même de ce que pourrait être une société idéale autour de la notion du buen vivir. Et dans cette société du buen vivir, les conditions matérielles de vie de l'humanité sont intimement liées à celles de la nature. Donc il n'y a pas de contradiction dans la société du buen vivir entre d'une part l'écologie et d'autre part le social. Et au contraire, la remise en cause de l'anthropocentrisme, la mise en perspective d'une nouvelle relation à la nature va de pair avec la définition d'une nouvelle société des communs où justement le citoyen accède aux droits en se réappropriant son propre destin, réaccréditer l'idée qu'on peut changer le monde de façon systémique. C'est-à-dire que la crise a amplifié un sentiment d'impuissance, elle a accentué les crises de légitimité des structures censées nous représenter, le corps scientifique, l'État, les institutions internationales, et on voit que nombreux citoyens nous disent on n'y croit plus, c'est fini. Mais moi je crois que justement, un des enjeux, c'est de réaccréditer la croyance dans cette capacité transformatrice en réhabilitant des légitimités démocratiques.
Fundamentalmente se dice que las enfermedades zoonóticas aumentan cuando hay más presión sobre la vida animal y vegetal, ¿no? Entonces, en la medida en que tenemos una crisis climática, también vamos a tener una crisis sanitaria como consecuencia de esas nuevas pandemias. Se habla también de la industria agrícola, ¿no? El tamaño de esas industrias, ¿no? y el modo en que se está produciendo a nivel internacional afecta también, ¿no? a las nuevas enfermedades. Entonces creo que al final todo está bajo ese paraguas de la crisis climática. Creo que es una cuestión en la que ya muchos autores bueno, se han parado a pensar y creo que no podemos seguir demorando esa pregunta. O sea, creo que al final la cuestión es la crisis climática, cómo abordarla, cómo hacer una transición energética y sobre todo cómo traducir esas grandes palabras en acciones reales, porque emergencia climática, crisis climática, todo eso está absolutamente vacío de contenido si no aclaramos, ¿no?, a qué nos referimos con todo eso. Transición energética, ¿qué es y cómo se va a hacer? Y a qué ritmos, ¿no?, se van a hacer. O sea, qué tipo de velocidad va a llevar esa transición. O sea, y quién gana y quién pierde. Me parece que al final es una cuestión de economía política. No podemos pensar que esto es un juego win-win. O sea, no es verdad. Hay siempre actores que salen perdiendo, ¿no? Y creo que debemos tener claro siempre esa cuestión, ¿no? ¿Quiénes serán los actores emergentes que salgan ganando y quiénes pueden perder, ¿no? Y desde luego, cuando hablamos de la distribución del poder y de este conflicto, tenemos que tener claro que quienes han de perder son quienes probablemente han ganado desde el punto de vista histórico, ¿no? Y si esto es una cuestión de clase, pues tendremos que volver a hacer un análisis de clase, aunque las clases sociales como tal no existan, ¿no? Aunque ahora haya que hablar de precariado y tengamos que poner un nuevo vocabulario a viejos conceptos, al final estamos, ¿no?, con las viejas cuestiones de la propiedad, del bien común y otros problemas que son atemporales, que son universales.
Y luego está la dificultad y la gran amenaza de la transformación forzosa del mundo del trabajo, donde finalmente el mundo del trabajo, al parecer, han descubierto algunos que es fantástico que colonice completamente la vida doméstica. Que las personas hagan su trabajo desde sus casas y no tengan espacios habilitados de los cuales las empresas privadas y el Estado son responsables de tener. Reduciendo sus costos, reduciendo su responsabilidad con los trabajadores. Para mí es una forma más de flexibilización de ese vínculo. Cada vez se hace más delgado ese vínculo. No solo son malos contratos, es un grano más de arena en la precarización del empleo. Las personas que tienen empleos a distancia donde pueden desplegar su creatividad y tener prácticas, estamos hablando de los programadores, los diseñadores que trabajan de manera autónoma, como innovadores, etcétera, son una fracción, pero ínfima, de los usuarios de tecnologías digitales que ahora están haciendo sus trabajos a distancia. La mayor parte son personas que hacían trabajos ejecutivos en empresas o en el Estado, de procesos, de control de procesos, y que ahora los tienen que hacer a distancia, en sus casas, muchas veces ni siquiera con los equipamientos que pueda proveer la empresa, utilizando sus propios computadores, sus propias conexiones a Internet, etc.
Lo que tenemos que pensar es en esos bullshit jobs, ¿no?, en esos trabajos que realmente nadie quiere, que están mal remunerados o que no tienen una utilidad social, porque la definición de David Graeber de bullshit jobs no es tanto un salario mal remunerado, sino, o sea, un empleo mal pagado, sino el hecho de que determinadas profesiones no tienen utilidad, o sea, no tienen una utilidad social, no son beneficiosas para prácticamente nadie.
Y eso sí que es un debate que tiene que ser un debate muy importante, donde todo el mundo tiene que participar. ¿Cuál va a ser el concepto de trabajar, el concepto de trabajo? ¿Cuál va a ser en un mundo donde muchos empleos clásicos van a desaparecer a favor de un empleo, digamos, tecnológico, que seguramente va a requerir menos trabajadores? Y ese sí que es un tema enormemente difícil de resolver, pero al que hay que ponerse colectivamente a pensar y a hacer cosas en la buena dirección. Que las nuevas generaciones también nos den su visión de las cosas, porque igual estamos pensando los mayores como si fuéramos jóvenes, y cuando hay jóvenes que saben mucho mejor lo que desearían que fuera el mundo de mañana, ¿no? Pero sí es verdad que hay el debate entre las pensiones y los salarios es un debate muy importante, ¿no? Es decir, ¿quién se prima más? El final de la vida con las pensiones altas o el inicio de la vida con salarios que te permitan mirar hacia el futuro. Lo pongo como ejemplo, ¿no? Pero que hay muchos temas de relaciones entre generaciones que van a tener que ser repensados, reestructurados.
I could see among the people of my generation, they suffer a lack of opportunity and a lack of perspective. I mean, youth unemployment is a structural problem around the world, right? From Europe, but also in Latin America and in Africa. It surged in the previous crisis, and it is going to surge in the upcoming one. The first ones to lose their income when the COVID wave hit were young, but it's still not just an unemployment thing we're talking about. In the West, salaries never quite recovered after the 2008 crisis, and conditions never quite recovered either. And unless we have something in mind that we can do differently than then, it will get worse. I mean, yes, some propose cutting working hours altogether and freeing ourselves from offices and restraints, having more time to ourselves, which apparently is something that we can do thanks to tech advancements, but that requires a much deeper transformation. Because with or without tech, reality is in many countries, people are already working less. They are working part-time jobs as their only source of income. And if working less means earning less, but rents remain the same or general costs of living remain the same, then the only extra time everyone will be getting will be used to get another job.
Buena parte de los problemas que nos vamos a tener que enfrentar en cómo definimos el empleo en el futuro va a tener que ver con despegarnos de la idea industrial. Antes pensábamos en horas hombre, cuántas personas destinábamos a hacer una tarea y en función de eso organizábamos la sociedad. Y ahora las jornadas de 8 horas, concatenación, cadena de producción, todo eso en el mundo digital desaparece. O sea, si vamos a trabajar en un mundo conectado con la tecnología 5G, ayudándonos a vigilar que los procesos están funcionando, vamos a necesitar cada vez una parte creativa más que una parte ejecutiva. O sea, la parte creativa va a cobrar muchísimo más relevancia frente a la parte ejecutiva y cambiar el mantra de que nosotros estamos pagando por 8 horas de trabajo o 40 horas de trabajo mensuales va a ser el gran shift que vamos a tener que afrontar como sociedad. El valorar a la gente por su capacidad de aportar ideas creativas y solucionar problemas más que de hacer tareas repetitivas y automatizables.
And then there's the sort of tech facilitated network where you have, again, in almost immediately as the pandemic hit us, startup spaces or hacker spaces organizing hackathons, trying to design apps or information platforms that would facilitate the communication of certain information, that would facilitate matching of people who have, for example, things to donate and those who are in need. So you see a lot of these support networks also coming up in the tech space. Now the question is maybe, where does the role of the state play in this?
What I do think that we are particularly capable of doing nowadays is bringing that local perspective, bringing it together to a collective global perspective, to conform this global perspective that we can jointly propose solutions to the crises that we face. This is something that I think we are particularly enabled to by these new technologies.
Hemos discutido recientemente aquí sobre el rol, por ejemplo, de las prácticas emergentes comunitarias que son valiosísimas y que a todos efectivamente nos demuestran que la capacidad creativa, esta creatividad social es extraordinaria. Sin embargo, no se nos tiene que olvidar que aparecen precisamente donde fallan los estados. En América Latina aparecen y se multiplican estas iniciativas de apoyo ciudadano, tanto a través de tecnologías, tanto en la presencialidad, hasta para el cuidado de niños, el cuidado de enfermos, el cuidado de los adultos, la entrega de alimentos.
What it has done is it's removed not only the concept of citizenship,
So citizenship is reduced to voting. You know, one of the simplest and not unimportant, but one of the simplest elements of citizenship, which has nothing to do with action or engagement or participation. And even there, really not much enthusiasm for voting, really.
Y la pandemia lo que ha puesto de manifiesto es que las redes son mucho más ágiles a la hora de ayudar a sus vecinos, mucho más ágiles de poner los recursos a disposición de las personas que lo necesitan y sobre todo mucho más inteligentes a la hora de priorizar versus polemizar. Entonces creo que este es el momento de que todas esas redes vayan aportando ese cambio de dinámicas en la gestión de la cosa común, del espacio común en el que todos estamos viviendo y que va a tener que afectar a muchos ámbitos de la vida, no solo el de la decisión política, sino también el de la educación, el de la sanidad, el de la movilidad, el cómo gestionamos nuestras fronteras y sobre todo si queremos seguir siendo un Homo economicus o otro tipo de especie mucho más empática con la salud, con los problemas medioambientales que nos están azuzando y que en parte nos van a ir marcando la agenda en los siguientes años.
Pensando en el futuro, me parece que esta pandemia que no ha finalizado y no sabemos cuánto tiempo durará ni las consecuencias que tendrá, tiene que ser una oportunidad para plantear algunos debates de fondo. Se utiliza mucho la palabra normalidad y yo no quiero volver a la normalidad que existía en la etapa prepandemia, que implicaba que en América Latina, concretamente, yo estoy en América Latina, entonces no puedo hablar de lo que pasa en todo el mundo, pero que en América Latina haya hambre. Se ha naturalizado que haya hambre en América Latina. Una región extremadamente rica. Argentina, Brasil, Paraguay, Bolivia, Perú, Colombia, Venezuela. Son países donde no puede haber hambre.
I would like to talk about the sandstorm metaphor. You know, if you've ever been to a desert or spent time in a desert and experienced a sandstorm, you will realize how sandstorms operate. The moment that there is a sandstorm, it's horrifying. It's quite scary. You can't fight it. All you can do is to cover your face, cover your head, and wait for the sandstorm to pass. What is really interesting, though, about sandstorms is that once it passes, the landscape around you is going to be entirely transformed. You know, certain sand dunes that were quite large become quite small, and small ones become quite large, and some sand dunes don't even exist anymore. And I feel like we are going through this sandstorm, not just COVID-19 as one of the main components of that sandstorm, but we know that the world was changing even prior to this. There were all sorts of issues that's been happening, especially at the American sphere and the Western sphere for years. And this is where we have an opportunity for smaller countries that did not have the power to negotiate and to bargain politically in a system that was set in stone. Now the system is changing, and there are many opportunities here for countries, smaller countries, weaker countries, isolated countries in the Southern Hemisphere in particular, to make their moves and to slowly try to transform and to accommodate the new changes for the interest of themselves and of their people as well.
We will not see a transition, this interim that you mentioned, of the old normality, the old world, to a new one immediately. It will go in different dimensions because we don't have, as humanity, the same clock, the same timetable, and we do not act the same, we do not think the same. And that's why we have to consider this multi-dimensional level to face it.
The loss of, at the political level in particular, of the idea that imagination and creativity and even intuition about where we could possibly be going, could go to get ourselves into a new track, that's been just pushed out of the way. We can't get out of this unless we actually use our imaginations and draw upon people who have imagination, as opposed to promoting to the top people who don't have imaginations, but are good at very precise, narrow things, which makes them very bad leaders for societies, whether they're towns or provinces or states or countries, or even at the international level.
Si algo de positivo ha tenido esta crisis es que justamente la excepcionalidad ha supuesto como una especie de situación de tabula rasa, en el sentido de que el mundo se ha parado por completo al mismo tiempo, y creo que de alguna forma esto ha generado un momento bastante propicio para repensar las estructuras, para reevaluar nuestros modos de vida y para proponer algunas medidas más audaces o más atrevidas, ¿no? Pienso, por ejemplo, en las regularizaciones masivas a personas migrantes que se han hecho en países como Portugal o Italia. Pienso en medidas como la renta básica universal o algunos intentos o aproximaciones que se han hecho en algunos países. Pienso en los impuestos a las grandes fortunas, que también se están impulsando desde distintas partes del mundo, o en estas voces que hemos vuelto a ir también pidiendo la condonación de la deuda externa de los países empobrecidos, porque ahora más que nunca durante esta emergencia necesitaban esos recursos para salvar vidas.
Actually, it's people like me who are sort of aware that there's a problem, and people who are not like me, who are not aware that there's any problem at all, that really needs to be reached by next year's conferences. And so I'm hoping that when it comes, it will not be sort of having to think about the planet, but really sort of getting down to how do I, in my own little sphere, make a difference, make a change, or at least stop adding to the problem. Whether it's with what I do when I go shopping, whether it's the amount of travel that I do, whether it's, whether I turn on my generator or not. All these little things are things that we need to understand, and also to be shown perhaps that it will make a difference to the world.
Il y a la question du crime d'écocide, qui, moi, me paraîtrait quelque chose d'important à faire reconnaître également au niveau international, et puis prendre de nouvelles initiatives, comme par exemple les questions de réserves de vie sauvage, aux côtés des réserves de biosphère UNESCO, et bien faire en sorte que le meilleur moyen de restaurer la biodiversité, c'est surtout plus de toucher à la nature, et donc d'avoir dans le monde des réserves de vie sauvage. Ça existe, ce n'est pas encore reconnu par les institutions internationales. Bref, dans les actions à mener à l'avenir, nous on pense par exemple au statut de réfugié climatique, eh bien, la question de l'articulation entre les acteurs et donc de l'articulation entre les différentes légitimités nous semble essentielle.
Nature, climate, all the consumption that we have been making, that we exhausted reality, we exhausted nature, we exhausted the planet, and we are paying back for it. So that is, on a philosophical level, on a methodological level, is extremely important, but on technical level as well. Can the new this current economic system sustain the situation as we see it right now? Can the humanity continue to have that materialistic approach to nature, that consumption-based approach to nature, to reality? Can we do that?
It's just as important as reason. It's just as important as reason. Imagination, maybe more important than reason. And certainly in times of crisis, imagination is far more important than reason.
No hemos sido suficientemente eficientes en ejercitar el músculo de la rendición de cuentas. Y cuando esta pandemia pase, lo que la gente va a querer es moverse a la normalidad y al día a día. Y lo que debería pasar es una comisión que revise exhaustivamente, compuesta por ciudadanía, por expertos, por científicos y demás, que examine todas y cada una de las decisiones que se tomaron en estos meses.
So I think there is, in a way, this was a step backward, which we're forced to, but I'm sure that the step forward will bring us to a better position.
Creo que dentro de todas estas tragedias humanas, porque no podemos olvidar pues el número muy elevado de muertes y el número de personas que están atrás de los números, yo creo que podemos tener esta lección de cómo esta pandemia puede pues rescatar estos valores de cooperación.
We need a reform of the neoliberal globalization because the neoliberal globalization has come to an end in the climate crisis, in the resources crisis, in the financial crisis, and now in the COVID crisis. And we need more, let's say, equality on the UN level, meaning on the global level, and in, I would say, each of our societies.
There's no way that we're really going to close the gap with inequalities or fix the systemic inequalities if we don't become a little bit more proactive with policy and stop just doing kind of a reactionary anti-discrimination and equality framework versus like actually creating policies to equalize it.
But what if we can organize care in this rather decentralized way by mobilizing community support and also recognizing that at the state level?
No nos podemos quedar en la solución creativa y maravillados con la solución creativa emergente de las comunidades, o de las familias, o de los niños, o de los profesores, sino más bien con cómo el Estado ha ido consolidando aún más su rol subsidiario y no atiende estas necesidades realmente como derechos, ¿ya?
Mira, los bienes públicos globales, y hay muchos que tienen que ser defendidos. Ahora la salud global, el cambio climático, los alimentos, el agua, todas estas cosas, la nueva ciudad, cómo va a ser, todas estas cosas son de importancia global y requiere, por lo tanto, participación global.
We shouldn't try to reinvent the wheel. Exactly. We have the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of them exactly are seeking to eliminate poverty and promote equality. Some of them are addressing issues like water, health, sanitation, minorities, education of minorities, and so on.
Es decir, tenemos que procurar que el uso de nuestras riquezas y recursos naturales, primero, que esté en nuestras manos, y segundo, que sea un uso sustentable. Es decir, basta de prácticas extractivas que destruyan la naturaleza, el biosistema, el equilibrio ecológico, etc.
And it's a fight about making human beings the ultimate end of human action, and not inversing causality as we've done so often in the last few decades, of making human beings an instrument of the accumulation of capital or of the market or so on and so forth. So, you know, the supremacy of human beings over capital and not the primacy of capital over human beings.
Pues depende que también tengamos una actitud de desapego a todo esto que nos ha venido desde el pasado, sea de izquierdas, sea de derechas. Nosotros tenemos que buscar nuevas bases, unas bases que estén orientadas a lo común como los bienes comunes, como el espacio común, como los recursos y como nuestra propia existencia, nuestra propia identidad.
Can we stop this culture of things, this culture of accumulation of wealth for the sake of the accumulation of emotions and feelings and love, and also a human kind of collective interest? These are actually, in my opinion, the messages that we need to concentrate on, try to explore and to build on, rather than continuing business as usual and only thinking when the vaccine is coming so we can go back to normal. Normal was sick. Ordinary was bad. And if this does not awaken us, I am afraid in the future we may face even much worse, severe crises. I hope not, but this is an awakening call for all of us.